September of 1913 was one of the wettest on record in Madison County, North Carolina. The laurel thickets dripped for weeks straight, and the creek behind the Bowen Hollow ran brown and angry, smelling of loam and iron. People said the mountains themselves were grieving. Whether that was true or not, something was certainly ending in that hollow. Something that had been going on for more than 50 years. The cabin sat just where Shelton Creek curved east toward the ridge. A place so well settled into the land that the moss had grown up the foundation logs all the way to the windowsills, as if the earth was slowly reclaiming what had been borrowed from it. There were people outside. That was the first remarkable thing Dr. Thomas Ledbetter noticed when his borrowed mule picked its way down the mud-slicked trace that served as a road. People standing in the rain, dozens of them, old men and old women, their hats soaked through. Young mothers holding babies wrapped tight against the wet. Children perched on fence rails, bare feet swinging. All of them quiet. All of them watching the cabin. Ledbetter was 29 years old. He had graduated from the University of North Carolina Medical School 2 years prior, taken a position with the newly constituted Madison County Health Board, and had been sent up into the hollows and ridges to do what the board euphemistically called an assessment of folk medicine practices. What they meant was find out what these mountain people were doing instead of seeing real doctors and put a stop to it. Ledbetter had driven his borrowed mule over 3 ridges and through 2 creek fords that morning, and he was wet to the skin and already irritable before he even tied the animal to the fence post and ducked through the gate. An old man sitting on a cut-off stump looked up at him. The old man had the broad, weathered face of someone who had spent 70 years outdoors. He said nothing, just looked at Ledbetter's medical bag and then back at his face, and then looked away again, as if making a small judgment, and concluding it was not his concern. "Is this the Bowen place?" Ledbetter asked. "Has been since before your daddy was born," the old man said. A woman appeared in the doorway, younger, perhaps 40, with dark hair and quick eyes. She looked at Ledbetter's bag the same way the old man had, but her gaze held longer. "You're the doctor they sent," she said. It was not a question. "Dr. Thomas Ledbetter, the County Health Board." "I know who you are," the woman said. "She's been asking for you." This surprised him. He had not announced his visit. He had not known himself until that morning that he would be coming here specifically. And yet somehow Old Nettie Bowen, dying in a cabin at the back end of a hollow that barely appeared on county maps, had been asking for him. He followed the woman inside. The smell hit him first, not the smell of death, which he knew from the wards. That sweetish, close smell of organs failing. This was something else, green and dry and ancient, the smell of 1,000 gathered plants. Bundles hung from every inch of the rafters, dried stems tied with twine, their labels written in a small, precise hand on scraps of paper. He could identify some of them: yarrow, ironweed, black cohosh. Others were unfamiliar, their Latin names unknown to him, if they had Latin names at all. The woman in the bed was very old. He had expected that. She was 72, and she had been ill for some weeks according to the county record. What he had not expected was the quality of her stillness. Most dying people have a collapsed look, a falling inward of the face. Nettie Bowen lay in her bed as if she had arranged herself there deliberately. Her white hair was braided and laid across her shoulder. Her hands, folded on the quilt, were the hands of a woman who had worked with them for 7 decades. Large and knotted, the skin thin as paper over the knuckles, but the fingers still long and capable looking. Her eyes were closed, and then they opened. They were gray, not the faded gray of an old woman's eyes, a deep, clear, considered gray, the color of river water over slate. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was steady. Not the thin voice of a dying woman, but the voice of a woman who was choosing to leave, who had decided the terms. He found a stool and pulled it close. The dark-haired woman, he would learn her name, was Birdie. Birdie Plemons moved to the other side of the bed and stood with her arms folded, watching. "You came to write down what I know," Nettie Bowen said. "Something like that," he said. "The county health board is—" "I know what the county health board is." A pause. The sound of rain. "They think I'm a superstition, a curiosity, an old woman who makes teas and talks to plants." The gray eyes held him steady. "I'm going to tell you something, doctor, and I want you to listen carefully, because I'm only going to say it once, and then I'm going to sleep for a while, and when I wake up, I'm going to tell you the rest." He had his notepad out. He waited. "I have been practicing medicine in this hollow for 52 years, she said. "I have delivered 411 babies. I have treated measles, typhoid, tuberculosis, bone fractures, snake bites, burns, and infections of every variety you can name, and several you cannot. I have sat with more dying people than you will see in your entire career. And I have learned—" She paused, and something moved across her face that he could not immediately name. "I have learned that medicine is not just about what you can do. It is about what you choose to do. Do you understand the difference?" He said he thought he did. "No," she said, with something almost like kindness. "You don't. Not yet." She closed her eyes again. "Birdie, bring me the book." Birdie reached under the bed and produced a leather journal, small and dark and very old, its cover worn smooth with decades of handling. She laid it on the quilt beside Nettie's folded hands. Nettie did not open it. She did not even look at it, but her right hand moved, slowly, and rested on its cover. Her fingers spread flat against the leather. "In there," she said, "are 14 names. Beside each name is a plant. Beside each plant is a word. The word is either helped or did not help." She opened her eyes again and fixed them on Ledbetter. "I want you to understand, before you read it, what did not help means. It does not mean I couldn't. It means I didn't." The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain fell straight and steady. "To understand the weight of that list," she said, and her voice was already drifting, already traveling somewhere else, somewhere inland and long ago. "You need to understand the woman who made it, and the 70 years that gave her the authority to believe she could." The Hollow and the Teacher. Her name was Nettie. Just Nettie, for most of her childhood. The last name, Bowen, came from the man she would marry at 24. She was born in the spring of 1841, in the same hollow where she would die 72 years later, in a cabin that her grandfather had built from chestnut logs back when the mountains were still mostly Cherokee country. The county was Madison. The state was North Carolina. The world beyond the ridge, the world of cities and trains and political speeches, might as well have been the moon. She was the third of 7 children. Her father worked a small corn patch and ran a few cattle on the common land up on the ridge. Her mother kept the house, kept the garden, kept the children fed. It was her mother's mother, her grandmother, the woman everyone in the hollow called Granny Rue, who noticed, when Nettie was perhaps 8 years old, that the girl had an uncommon gift for observation. Most children, taken into the woods, see green. They see trees and bushes, and if they're paying close attention, maybe the difference between a blackberry and a pokeweed. Nettie saw everything. She saw the way the ramps grew thickest where the water table was close to the surface. She saw how the black cohosh preferred north-facing slopes where the soil stayed cool. She saw that the bloodroot always came up first, before the rest of the spring flowers, as if it was impatient, and that the bloodroot's red sap left stains on your fingers that looked disturbingly like blood. Which was, she would later understand, precisely the point. The plant was announcing itself. Granny Rue saw the girl noticing these things, and she began to teach her. Granny Rue's knowledge was layered, accreted, over her own long life, from multiple sources. There was the knowledge she had inherited from her grandmother, which was purely Scots-Irish Appalachian in character. The European herbalism that the first settlers had brought across the ocean and adapted to the New World plants they found waiting for them. And then there was the other layer, the deeper one, the one she didn't talk about in mixed company. In 1838, when Granny Rue was a young woman, the United States Army had come into these mountains and begun removing the Cherokee people from land they had occupied for 1,000 years. The Trail of Tears. More than 4,000 people died on that forced march westward. But not all the Cherokee went. Some hid in the deep coves and hollows of the Smoky Mountains, in places so remote that the soldiers couldn't, or wouldn't, find them. These people, the ones who stayed, would eventually be recognized as the Eastern Band of Cherokee, and they would remain in these mountains forever. Before the removal, a Cherokee woman named Aida, some called her by the English name she'd taken, Sarah, had been a neighbor of Granny Rue's family for many years. They had traded goods, shared medical knowledge, borrowed tools, and looked after each other's children in the way that close neighbors do in isolated mountain communities, regardless of what the larger world thought about such arrangements. When the removal came, Aida and her daughter disappeared into the high country. She sent word, once, that they had made it to a safe place. After that, nothing. But in the 10 years before the removal, Aida had taught Granny Rue things. Not everything. No healer gives away everything. The knowledge itself is a form of protection, and you protect the people you love by making sure the knowledge passes only to those who have earned it. But she had taught her about the plants that the Cherokee had used for generations, that the Scots-Irish settlers hadn't recognized yet. The specific preparations of golden seal root for infections, the way to use the inner bark of the slippery elm for stomach troubles, the dosages of black cohosh that would ease a woman's pain during labor. She had taught her the difference between plant families that looked similar but acted differently. The difference, for instance, between the wild carrot and the poison hemlock, which could kill a full-grown man in an hour. And she had taught her something else, something that didn't have a name exactly, but that Granny Rue tried to pass along to Nettie as best she could. A plant doesn't care who you are, Granny Rue told Nettie on a warm afternoon in May when the girl was perhaps 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on the cabin floor, sorting dried herbs into clay crocks. It'll heal a good man and a bad man the same. It doesn't know the difference. She paused, pressing dried yarrow into a crock and tamping it down with her thumb. But the healer knows the difference. That's what makes the healer different from the plant. Young Nettie looked up. Doesn't that mean the healer ought to treat everyone the same? If the plant doesn't care? Granny Rue looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, but it was a complicated smile, one that contained things Nettie wasn't old enough yet to read. You'll think about that question for the rest of your life, she said. Good. You should. The science of it. Let us be precise about what Nettie was learning, because it is important. This was not magic. It was not superstition. It was not the rattling of bones over fever-racked children while a preacher prayed. What Granny Rue was teaching her granddaughter was an empirical body of knowledge, the accumulated results of generations of careful observation, trial, error, and refinement, conducted not in laboratories but in hollows and cabins and at bedsides, in the only laboratory these people had, the living world itself. Take golden seal, Hydrastis canadensis, a small plant with a single hairy stem, deeply lobed leaves, and a root that, when you cut it, reveals the most extraordinary bright yellow color. The Cherokee had used it for centuries as an antimicrobial agent, rubbing the cut root on wounds to prevent infection, brewing strong teas from the root to treat sore throats and eye infections. The active compounds, Ledbetter would later understand, were berberine and hydrastine, both of which are genuinely effective against a wide range of bacteria. When Granny Rue showed Nettie how to identify the plant by its smell, sharp, earthy, almost like turmeric, how to harvest the root in the fall, when the concentration of active compounds was highest, how to dry it properly to preserve its potency, and how to prepare a wash that was strong enough to be effective without being so strong, it burned the tissue. She was teaching pharmacology. The vocabulary was different. The mechanism of action was not understood, but the knowledge was real. Or take wild cherry bark, Prunus serratina. The inner bark of this tree contains compounds called cyanogenic glycosides that, in the body, produce small amounts of hydrogen cyanide. This sounds alarming, but in small doses, it has a powerful antitussive effect. It suppresses coughing. Combined with the demulcent properties of slippery elm bark, which coats and soothes irritated mucous membranes, you had a preparation that was genuinely effective against croup, whooping cough, and the deep, dry coughs of winter respiratory infections. The pharmaceutical industry would eventually isolate these compounds and put them in cough syrup. But mountain healers in Madison County were using them in 1841, and they worked. Or take black cohosh, Actea racemosa. The tall plant with the white flower spikes, the one that favors the cool, north-facing slopes. Its root contains compounds with estrogen-like activity. Phytoestrogens. Women in labor who were having difficulty with contractions were sometimes given small doses. Women suffering from the worst of the change of life were given it regularly. Modern clinical trials have produced mixed results on its efficacy for menopausal symptoms, but for labor, Its use as a uterine stimulant was well established in traditional medicine long before any clinical trial existed. Granny Roo taught Nettie the specific preparation, not the root raw, because raw it was too strong, but dried and ground and steeped in boiling water for precisely as long as it took to say the Lord's Prayer twice. And she taught her the signs that told you when it was working and when to stop. And she taught her about foxglove, digitalis purpurea, the tall, spotted purple flower that grew at the edges of clearings and along fence lines, the most dangerous plant Granny Roo knew. She showed it to Nettie when the girl was 12, crouching down beside a stand of it at the edge of the hayfield and holding Nettie's wrist firmly while she spoke. "This one will kill you if you guess wrong," she said. "And it will save someone who is dying if you get it exactly right. There is no middle ground with foxglove. Do you understand me?" Nettie looked at the plants. Beautiful, really, their spotted throats almost like tiny faces looking up at you. She said she understood. An old Cherokee woman named Ayita taught me this one herself. She said her grandmother's grandmother knew it. The heart? Granny Roo tapped her own chest. Sometimes beats too slow, too weak, too irregular. Foxglove tea, very weak, very careful, can strengthen it. Push it back into rhythm. I have seen it bring a man back from what looked like death. She stood up, still holding Nettie's wrist. I have also seen a wrong dose stop a healthy heart in under an hour. So you do not touch foxglove until you have learned everything else I know, and you do not use it without me present. And if you ever give it to someone and they die, you will carry that forever. Do you understand? Nettie understood. She was 12. She was already understanding things that grown adults in cities with educations never came close to understanding. Nar, the first life. She was 16 when she saved her first life alone. It was February of 1857, a cold that had settled into the hollow like a tenant who didn't intend to leave. Her neighbor's youngest child, a boy named Jesse, 2 years old and pink-cheeked until that week, had come down with a croup so severe his lips were turning blue. The child's parents had come running through the dark to the Bowen cabin, the father carrying the boy wrapped in a blanket, the child's breathing a terrible seal bark sound that Nettie could hear from 20 feet away. Granny Roo was bedridden that winter with her own illness, the cold that would take her, ultimately, the following spring. Nettie's mother called for her, and Nettie came into the main room in her nightgown, took one look at the blue-lipped child, and felt something settle into place inside her. Not calm, exactly. More like precision, like a lens focusing. "Get the fire built up," she said to the child's father, who was a big man and completely helpless in this moment, which was often true of big men. "High and hot, and a pot, the biggest one you have." She went to her grandmother's shelves. Granny Roo had given her the key to the medicine cabinet when she first fell ill weeks ago, and they both knew what that meant. And she took down dried wild cherry bark, dried mullein leaf, and a small bundle of dried thyme. She packed the wild cherry bark into the pot first, covered it with water, and set it on the fire. While it heated, she took a length of linen and formed it into a tent shape. When the pot began to steam, she held the child in her lap, leaned him forward over the steam, and draped the linen tent over both their heads so that neither the steam nor the medicinal vapors could escape. The theory, as Granny Roo had explained it, was simple. The steam loosened the swollen membranes in the throat and bronchia. The compounds in the wild cherry bark suppressed the spasm that was causing the croup's characteristic bark. The mullein, a natural expectorant, helped the child's body clear the mucus. The thyme was antimicrobial. Together, they addressed the immediate crisis while giving the child's immune system the support it needed. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of sitting under a linen tent in the heat and steam, the child's bark gradually softening, his breathing gradually deepening, until at last he slept against Nettie's chest with the easy, open-mouthed sleep of a child whose body has decided to live. She carried him to the settle and laid him down and went outside into the cold because she was overheated from the steam, and she needed a moment. The stars were extraordinary, clear and brittle and close in the February sky. She stood in the snow in her bare feet and nightgown and let the cold come in. She had done it. She had looked at a dying child and known what to do and done it. When she came back inside, the child's mother was weeping with relief, clutching the boy to her chest, not caring that Nettie had forgotten to be modest about her nightgown, not caring about anything except that her son was breathing. The father, the big, helpless man, was sitting at the table with his face in his hands. Granny Rue, from her sickbed in the back room, called for Nettie. She went in and sat on the edge of the bed. Granny Rue's hand found hers in the dark. "You did it," Granny Rue said. "Yes." "How did it feel?" Nettie thought about it. "Like I knew what I was doing," she said. "Like the knowing came from somewhere outside me and just used me." Granny Rue was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That's how it feels when you're doing it right. When you're working with the plant and not just applying it." Another pause. "Remember that feeling, but remember something else too." "What?" "You didn't fail tonight. The sickness was weaker than you. But there will come a day. There will come many days when you're stronger than the sickness. When you could save someone, and the choice of whether to do so will rest entirely in your hands." She squeezed Nettie's fingers. "When that day comes, remember how you felt tonight. The goodness of it. The clean goodness." Nettie said, "I'll always feel that way." Granny Rue said nothing, but in the dark, Nettie thought she heard the old woman sigh. Not with sadness exactly, but with a kind of tired foreknowledge, the sigh of someone who has seen enough of the world to know that certainty, in young people, is a form of innocence, and that innocence, however beautiful, has a fixed and finite lifespan. The education continues. In the 3 years before the war came, Nettie completed her education. Granny Rue died in the spring of 1858, which left a hole in the hollow that nothing ever quite filled. But she had done her work. She had taken a brilliant, observant girl and built from that raw material something remarkable. A healer whose pharmacological knowledge combined 3 distinct traditions into a coherent, practical system. Nettie inherited Granny Rue's cabinet, her notebooks, her dried stock, and her patience. She was 17. She was unmarried and would remain so for another 7 years. The people of the Hollow received her with something between trust and uncertainty. She was young. She was a woman, without a husband, and she was standing in the place where an old woman with 50 years of authority had just stood. But the fever season came that fall, and she treated it competently and carefully, and nobody died of it who had come to her. And by Christmas, the Hollow had made its decision. She was their healer now. She was methodical in a way that surprised people. she kept records. In a series of blank books, she had her father order from Asheville. She wrote down every patient she treated: name, age, complaint, treatment, dosage, outcome. This was not common practice. Most healers carried their knowledge in their heads, which meant it died with them. Nettie wrote it down, from the very beginning, because it was the only way she knew to learn. If she tried a treatment and it failed, she needed to know what she had tried and why it had failed so that she could try something else next time. If a treatment worked, she needed to know exactly what she had done so she could replicate it. These record books, it would turn out, were not the only journals she would eventually keep. She married James Bowen in 1865, in the middle of the war, which seems like an odd time to marry. But odd times sometimes demand ordinary acts, and James Bowen was a quiet, steady man who understood what he was marrying, not just a wife, but a calling, and who never once, in 30 years of marriage, tried to make her choose. He worked his farm. She worked her hollow. They were, in the way of people who have found their counterparts, deeply happy. They had 3 children, 2 of whom survived to adulthood. But before the marriage, before the quiet years, first, the war. Madison County, divided. There is no delicate way to describe what the Civil War did to Madison County, North Carolina. It tore it in half. The county was not like the low-country South, with its plantations and its slave economy. Up in the mountains, slavery was rare. Not because the mountain people were more enlightened, exactly, but because the terrain and the economy didn't suit it. Most families here ran subsistence farms, grew their own food, ran their own cattle, made their own whiskey. The abstractions of Southern honor and the defense of slavery felt distant and political in a way that did not motivate mountain men to march off and die for them. What did motivate them, some of them at least, was loyalty to the Confederacy as a regional identity. And what motivated others was precisely the opposite: a suspicion of Confederate authority, a sense that the eastern lowland planter class had dragged them into a war that served no one in these hills, and a quietly burning unionism that had its roots in the decades of political neglect that had left Appalachian counties perpetually underrepresented and underserved by the state government in Raleigh. In Madison County, this division ran through families, through neighborhoods, through hollows. Brothers took different sides. Fathers and sons did not speak. Women trying to keep households alive while their men were gone received raids from one side or the other, depending on which way their politics were known to run. Nettie Bowen treated everyone. This was not a moral choice, exactly, or not only a moral choice, it was also a practical one. The hollow where she lived contained families from both sides of the divide, and if she had declared herself for one cause or the other, half her patients would have been left without a healer. She told people, when they asked, that she was a healer, and sickness didn't carry a flag. Most people accepted this. A few didn't. She treated them anyway. Shelton Laurel. In January of 1863, something happened in Madison County that has never quite been forgotten, though it has often been suppressed. A group of Union sympathizers from the Shelton Laurel Valley, most of them poor men with no military training, motivated by hunger and desperation as much as politics, had raided the county seat of Marshall, breaking into a salt storehouse and stealing supplies. Salt was not a minor thing in 1863, Without it, you couldn't preserve meat, and without preserved meat, your family starved. These men were not soldiers. They were neighbors who were hungry and whose families were being targeted by Confederate Home Guard raids. In retaliation, the Confederate 64th North Carolina Infantry, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Keith, descended on the Shelton Laurel community. They took 13 men and boys prisoner. The oldest was 60. The youngest was 13 years old. They marched them to a remote spot along the creek, and they shot them. This was not battle. This was execution. Some of the men were elderly. Some were children. They were shot in groups, and when the first volley didn't kill everyone, the soldiers reloaded and fired again. A few of the victims crawled away, wounded and died in the snow. The bodies were not returned to their families for weeks. Nettie was 22 years old when the news reached her hollow. She had known some of the dead. The Shelton family had kin throughout the county, and she had treated Shelton children for the usual mountain ailments over the years. She heard the story first from a woman named Hattie Shelton, who was a cousin of one of the victims, standing in Nettie's doorway, in the snow with a baby on her hip and another child clutching her skirt, shaking with cold and grief and a rage that had nowhere to go. Nettie took her in and fed her, and said nothing that afternoon beyond what was necessary. But that evening, alone in her workroom, she sat for a long time, staring at her shelves of dried plants and thinking about things that she would spend the next 50 years thinking about. She thought about who had given the order. His name was Colonel James Keith. He was later court-martialed, eventually after the war, though the charges were reduced and he never served significant prison time. History has largely forgotten him, but in Madison County, in the years and decades after the war, his name was not forgotten. He had a brother, a Major Garrett Keith, who served with the same unit. The wound and the choice. It was the summer of 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg had just been fought, though the news traveled slowly to these mountains. Nettie was 22, newly capable in ways that had come from 2 years of wartime medicine. She had been treating injuries that peacetime would never have produced, learning to work with inadequate supplies, learning to improvise. Major Garrett Keith arrived at her cabin on a July afternoon, on a litter carried by 2 Confederate soldiers. He had been shot through the upper left thigh. The ball had passed through cleanly, which was fortunate, but the wound had been improperly dressed for 3 days and was beginning to show the early signs of infection. The skin around the wound mouth was red and hot. The edges had begun to swell. He was running a modest fever. Nettie assessed the wound without expression. The 2 soldiers who had brought him, boys, really, 17 or 18, looking exhausted and frightened, explained that they'd had no surgeon available and had heard there was a good healer in this hollow who would treat anybody. Nettie told them to set him down on the table. She sent them outside with instructions to wait. She stood over Major Garrett Keith for a moment. He was perhaps 40, broad in the chest, dark-bearded, and entirely unconscious. The fever had taken him that far, which was perhaps fortunate, because it meant he couldn't watch her work or watch her think. She knew who he was. She had known from the moment they said the name Keith. She had been treating people in this county for 3 years, and the name Keith had come up with the other names: Shelton, Henson, Norton, the dead boys of Shelton Laurel, more times than she could count. She had held Hattie Shelton while that woman wept. She had treated the surviving children of the dead men, children who had no fathers now, who were growing up in cold and poverty because of the thing that had been ordered on that winter day. She knew that Major Garrett Keith had not given the order at Shelton Laurel. That had been his brother, Colonel James Keith. But she also knew, from what people told her, that Garrett Keith had been present, that he had been an officer in the same unit, that he had not, so far as anyone knew, refused the order, or objected, or done anything to stop it. She stood over him for a long time. The July afternoon was very warm. Outside, she could hear the two boys talking quietly. A crow was calling from the chestnut tree. She looked at her shelves. What the wound required was a thorough cleaning with a strong golden seal wash, followed by a poultice of plantain leaf, Plantago major, an extraordinary wound herb that reduced inflammation and drew out infection as reliably as anything she knew, followed by regular redressing and a course of internal golden seal tea to support his immune system against the existing bacterial load. Done correctly, with the wound at its current stage, he would almost certainly survive. His body was strong. The infection had not had time to spread to the deeper tissues. She had saved wounds far worse than this. She reached for the golden seal, and then she stopped. She stood with her hand on the jar for what felt like a very long time. In reality, it was perhaps 30 seconds. Then she reached past the golden seal. She reached for a different jar, one that contained a dried herb called boneset, Eupatorium perfoliatum, which would reduce his fever and ease his pain. It was a genuine medicine. It would make him more comfortable. It would not be cruel. He would not suffer more than he was already suffering, but it would not address the infection. She cleaned the wound with plain boiled water. She packed it with a light plantain poultice, enough to make it look properly dressed, not enough to do what the golden seal would have done. She brewed the boneset tea and had one of the boys give it to him when he woke. She told the boys, "The wound is dressed. Keep it clean. Change the dressing every day with boiled water. He should rest for 2 weeks before traveling." She knew, with the absolute certainty of her training, that 2 weeks of travel through July, heat with that wound dressed only with plantain and water, was not going to be enough. The infection would deepen. The fever would rise. Without golden seal, without the antimicrobial support his body needed, the bacteria already in that wound were going to spread. He would die believing she had done her best. She told no one. Her grandmother was dead by then, had been dead for 5 years, but standing in the doorway of the workroom, as if placed there by some mechanism of memory or guilt, Nettie saw, for just a moment, the shape of Granny Rue, the posture she had when she was watching, the folded arms, the complicated eyes. The image was gone in a moment. Of course it was. There was no one in the doorway. But the next morning, going through Granny Rue's few possessions that she still kept in a cedar box under the bed, things she had never been able to bring herself to dispose of, she found a small leather journal. It had been there for 5 years, and she had never opened it. She opened it now. It was empty. Blank pages from front to back. She understood. She took the journal to her table. She took up her pen. In her small, precise hand, she wrote a date at the top of the first page. She wrote a name. She wrote the plant that would have saved him. She wrote 2 words. Did not help. Then she wrote a single sentence. Shelton Laurel, January 18th, 1863. 13 dead. He was present and did not refuse. She closed the journal. She held it in her hands for a moment, then she placed it in the cedar box and closed the lid. She went back to work. The aftermath. Garrett Keith died, as she had known he would, of septicemia, blood poisoning from the infected wound, sometime in August of 1863. She heard of it secondhand, from one of the boys who had brought him, who stopped by her cabin 6 weeks later to tell her. The boy looked sorry. He said the major had spoken well of her, said she had done her best for him. She thanked the boy and gave him a small packet of dried yarrow for the cut on his hand, which was beginning to look angry. She felt nothing she could describe cleanly. Not satisfaction, not guilt, or not the acute guilt of having done something wrong. Something more complicated and less comfortable than either. A sense of having crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. She had exercised a kind of judgment that medicine, that the tradition she had been taught, did not officially sanction. She had decided alone that one man's life was worth less than the 14 lives he had helped to destroy. She did not know, in August of 1863, whether she had done right. She was not sure she would ever know. What she knew was that she had done it deliberately, with full knowledge of the consequences, and that she would have to live with that in a way that was different from anything she had lived with before. She was 22 years old. The years between. The rest of the 1860s were years of Reconstruction, the national word for the era, but also a smaller, more literal one for Madison County. Communities rebuilding after the specific violence of a civil war that had been, in these mountains, also a civil war in the intimate sense. Neighbor against neighbor, hollow against hollow. Families trying to reconstitute themselves across political divisions that had become associated with death. Nettie treated the aftermath. She treated the physical wounds first, the men who came home missing limbs, missing eyes, carrying the internal damage of 4 years of bad food and worse medicine. She treated the typhoid that followed the troop movements, the tuberculosis that followed the crowding, the infant mortality that followed the poverty. These were not exotic challenges. They were the ordinary catastrophes of the human body under stress, and she met them with her usual methodical competence. She also treated, in these years, a quieter kind of wound, the grief that didn't look like anything from the outside, the woman who stopped eating for no reason she could name, the man who sat on his porch from sunrise to sunset and didn't speak, the children who flinched at sudden sounds years after the last shot was fired. She had no name for any of this. The vocabulary didn't exist yet. She treated it with what she had, time and attention, the medicinal allies that could take the edge off the worst of it. Valerian root, which calmed the nervous system. Passion flower, which could ease anxiety without the addictive properties of the laudanum that had begun showing up in the county's patent medicine supplies. And she treated it with presence, sitting with people, listening, not trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, just bearing witness. This, too, was medicine. She knew it intuitively before she had words for it. She had not made another choice like the one she made in July of 1863. Not in the 1860s. Not yet. But the journal was there in the cedar box, and she took it out sometimes and looked at the one entry and thought about what her grandmother had told her. Write them down. Every one. So, you never forget the weight. One entry, one name, one plant she had chosen not to use. She had not forgotten the weight. The long work. By 1870, Nettie Bowen was 29 years old, married, the mother of her first surviving child, and the undisputed healer of her part of Madison County. This is the era that is hardest to tell quickly because it is fundamentally about the accumulation of time. 30 years, hundreds of patients, the ordinary miracle of a healer doing her work. The child pulled back from the brink of pneumonia, the woman whose difficult labor became survivable, the man whose infected tooth was treated with oil of cloves and golden seal before it could kill him via systemic infection, which it absolutely could and did in those days if you were unlucky. 30 years of this. In those 30 years, she made 11 more choices. Not 11 in a year, not even 11 in a decade necessarily. The choices came slowly, years apart, in situations that were always specific and always terrible in their specificity. She did not search for opportunities to exercise this judgment. If anything, she resisted it. The years between choices were years in which she treated the violent and the corrupt and the cruel with the same careful skill she brought to everyone else, in which she deliberately reminded herself of every reason not to exercise the authority she had granted herself. She saved people she despised. She worked as hard for the man who had beaten his wife as she did for the wife he had beaten. But there were 11 cases spread over 30 years in which she decided otherwise. Let us be precise about several of them. The Miller, 1874. His name was Calhoun Prewitt. He ran the grist mill at the head of the county road, and he had been beating his wife, a woman named Sarah, for the 17 years of their marriage. Everyone in the community knew about it. The marks on Sarah's face were known. The way she walked sometimes, carefully, guarding some internal injury, was known. Her children were pale and quiet, in the way of children who have grown up in the presence of constant danger. This was not unusual in that era or any era. Men beat their wives, and it was their legal right to do so, within limits so vague as to be meaningless, and the community's response was largely to look away. Nettie had treated Sarah Prewitt's injuries many times over the years. The broken rib, the blackened eyes, the deep bruising that took weeks to fade. Each time, she had treated them competently and without comment. Because what could she say? There was no legal recourse. There was no shelter to send Sarah to. The children needed their father's mill. In the spring of 1874, Calhoun Prewitt was brought to Nettie's cabin with a severe case of erysipelas, a bacterial skin infection that in that era, before antibiotics, could become life-threatening. The infection had started on his face and was spreading, the characteristic raised red rash moving down his neck and across his chest. He was feverish and clearly frightened. Erysipelas had a reputation as a death sentence. It was not if treated correctly. Nettie had treated it before with some success, using a combination of golden seal washes and, crucially, echinacea preparations that she had developed from her own observations and Granny Rue's notes. The echinacea, Echinacea purpurea, the purple coneflower that grew along the creek margins, had significant immune-stimulating properties. She had found that patients who received it fought bacterial infections more effectively. She could not have explained the mechanism, but she knew it worked. she could save Calhoun Prewitt. She stood over him for a long time, looking at the red-mapped geography of the infection on his face. She looked at Sarah Prewitt, who had come with him, and who stood against the wall of the cabin, with her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes on the floor. One of Sarah's hands was wrapped in a cloth. She had, the previous week, come to Nettie with 2 broken fingers. She had not explained how she had broken them. Nettie treated Calhoun Prewitt's fever with boneset and willow bark. She applied a cooling poultice to the worst of the rash. She gave him instructions for care that were technically correct, but strategically incomplete. She did not give him echinacea. She did not give him the golden seal. He died 8 days later. Septicemia again. The erysipelas had moved to his blood. When the news came to her, she went to the cedar box, and she wrote his name in the journal. She wrote the plants. She wrote the sentence. Sarah Prewitt, 17 years. The 2 fingers on her left hand were the 18th and 19th times I had treated his work on her body. Samani, 1989, on teen teak 81. This one was harder. His name was Abel Fordham, and he worked as a timber agent for one of the large lumber companies that had begun moving into the Appalachian Mountains in the post-war years, buying up logging rights and sending crews into the old-growth forests that had stood undisturbed for centuries. The timber industry was changing these mountains in ways that Nettie found profoundly distressing. Not because she was opposed to progress in any simple sense, but because she understood, from her work with plants, what the forest was and what was being lost. The old-growth trees were not just timber. They were a pharmacy, a watershed, a living system that the mountain communities depended on in ways both obvious and subtle. Fordham was not the only timber agent in the county, and he was not the worst. But he had done something specific. Upstream from several families whose children Nettie had treated, the logging company had dumped a quantity of waste, sawdust, bark tannins, the chemical residue of the timber processing, into a tributary of the creek. The families downstream had begun experiencing, over the course of 2 years, a cluster of illnesses. Digestive problems, skin rashes, a general lassitude in the children that Nettie had been puzzling over for months. It was when she traced the water that she understood. The poisoning was not dramatic. It was the slow, accumulative kind. The kind that a company could deny and a court would struggle to prove. Fordham had been told about it. A delegation of the affected families had confronted him, politely, and then not so politely, and he had brushed them off. The company's lawyers had been informed. Nothing changed. The waste continued to be dumped. Fordham came to her in the fall of 1881 with a kidney infection. Bad one. Flank pain, high fever, blood in his urine. Untreated, it would go to his blood and kill him within a week. Treated with the right preparations, she had found that strong golden seal tea combined with uva ursi leaf, Arctostaphylos uva ursi, the bearberry, with its antibacterial arbutin content, was remarkably effective. He would likely recover completely. She gave him the uva ursi. She did not give him the golden seal. He deteriorated over 3 days and died on the 4th. You will notice a pattern developing, and it is important that we look at it clearly rather than looking away. Nettie Bowen was not making these choices randomly. She was not making them emotionally, in the heat of anger, or grief, or a moment of impulse. She was making them methodically after long consideration, according to a set of criteria that she had developed and refined over years of moral reasoning, conducted, mostly, alone. By the 1880s, she had begun writing these criteria down. Not in the leather journal. That was for the records, the names and the plants, the weight-bearing entries. She wrote them in one of her blank medical books in a section at the back, in a handwriting smaller and more careful than her usual clinical notes, as if she were aware that these words required particular precision. We will never know exactly what those pages contained, because they were burned at her request after her death. But we can reconstruct some of her thinking from the fragments that Dr. Ledbetter recorded in his own notes after reading the journal, and from what Birdie Plemons later recalled of their conversations. The framework, as best as it can be reconstructed, worked something like this. Nettie drew a distinction between what she called recoverable harm and structural harm. A person who had committed recoverable harm, had done something cruel or violent in a moment of weakness or passion and was capable of being different, did not fall under her judgment. She treated such people fully, with everything she had, because she believed that healing could be part of their recovery from the pattern that had produced the harm. She had seen this happen. She had seen men who had committed acts of violence become, over years, genuinely different. Structural harm was different. It was the harm done by people who were not in a moment of weakness, but in a settled state. People for whom the cruelty was not an aberration, but a pattern, a system, a thing they would return to as certainly as water returns to a downward slope. The wife-beater on his 19th offense, the company agent choosing profits over the health of children, the man she would encounter in 1887. She also required, for herself, a burden of evidence. She did not act on rumor. She did not act on what she had been told. She acted on what she had seen, what she had treated, what her own hands had touched. Calhoun Prewitt's wife's broken fingers, 19 documented injuries over 17 years, the children from the Creek families with their chronic digestive ailments. She had treated them herself, followed the water herself, looked at the waste herself. She built cases in her mind, the way a court would, or should, build cases, and she required always that the choice be entirely her own. She told no one. She consulted no one. Because she understood, with absolute clarity, that what she was doing was outside any recognized moral or legal authority. She was not asking the community to validate her judgment. She was accepting the full weight of it herself. This, she wrote, in the small, careful handwriting, was the only thing that made it bearable. That she did not hide behind a community's anger or a court's imprimatur. She owned it. Every entry in the journal was hers, alone. Reverend Collis, 1887. The hardest one. His name was Marcus Collis, and he was a Methodist preacher who had come to the county in 1883 and built a congregation in the neighboring hollow. He was a compelling preacher, the kind whose sermons moved people in the chest, who could make you feel the reality of the divine in a way that the drier, more bookish ministers never managed. He was kind to the elderly. He visited the sick. He brought food to families in difficulty. For 3 years, he was widely loved. Nettie had heard things, from children mostly, the way children sometimes told things to the healer that they didn't tell anyone else, not parents, not kin, because the healer's cabin was a place where your body was attended to, without judgment, and that atmosphere sometimes spread to other kinds of disclosure. She had heard things, and she had sat with what she heard, and she had watched. What she had heard was true. She became certain of it over the course of 3 years. The certainty was specific and documented in her own private record, in her clinical notebook, in entries that she coded to protect the children who had told her, and that no one reading without the code could have deciphered. In 1887, Reverend Collis came down with pneumonia. It was a hard case, but not an exceptional one. She had treated worse. The right treatment was a combination of steam inhalation with eucalyptus and pine resin, pleurisy root, Asclepias tuberosa, to reduce inflammation of the pleural membranes and ease breathing, and elderberry preparations to support the immune response. All of it within her stock. All of it well within her capability. She gave him the steam. She gave him the pleurisy root. She did not give him the elderberry. She did not give him, crucially, the preparation of echinacea that she had come to believe was the most important element in treating pneumonia in otherwise healthy adults. It was enough to show treatment, not enough to prevent the pneumonia from progressing to its worst stage. He died on the 5th day. She went to the cedar box that evening, and she wrote his name. She wrote the plants. She wrote the sentence, which was the longest one in the journal, and which she later crossed through twice, with heavy strokes, so that it could never be read. She wept that night. She had not wept over the others. This was not because she doubted the judgment. She did not. She never doubted the judgment, even in her worst moments. She wept because he had been, in the parts of him she had seen, genuinely a good man. Good to the elderly, good to the sick, good to the families in difficulty. The thing he had done existed alongside those genuine qualities, not instead of them. He was not a simple monster. He was a complex one. And she understood that night that the complexity did not change the judgment, but that it did change the weight. She added the weight to what she was already carrying. Birdie. She met Birdie Plemons in 1882. Birdie was 18 years old, the daughter of a family from the next ridge, and she had been coming to Nettie for 2 years to watch and learn in the informal way that apprenticeships had always worked in mountain communities. Nettie had given her tasks, sorting, preparing, observing, without formally taking her on, waiting to see whether the girl was serious. She was serious. She was more than serious. She was gifted. She had good hands and good eyes, and the particular quality that Nettie had learned over 20 years to look for in potential healers, the ability to be fully present with a person who was suffering without being overwhelmed by that suffering. Not distance, not coldness, the opposite. A deep, natural warmth that nevertheless held its shape under pressure. Nettie took her on as a full apprentice in the spring of 1882. Birdie Plemons was, in many ways, a gift. She was energetic, where Nettie was growing methodical. She was enthusiastic, where Nettie had become reserved. She brought a quality of delight to the work. The delight of the gifted learner newly in possession of knowledge that works. That reminded Nettie of how she herself had felt at 16, standing in the night air after saving the little boy from croup. The clean goodness. Birdie was full of clean goodness. they worked together well. Nettie taught her everything she knew: the Cherokee-derived knowledge, the Scots-Irish traditions, the pharmacological reasoning she'd developed over 40 years of practice. She shared her clinical records, her observations, her thinking. She shared everything. Except one thing. Birdie knew about the journal. Nettie had never hidden the cedar box or the journal's existence. Birdie used the workroom daily, and the cedar box sat in its corner in plain sight. What she didn't know was what the journal contained. She had never asked, and Nettie had never offered, and there was an understanding, unspoken, that this was a private thing. But Birdie was observant. It was, after all, the quality that Nettie had selected her for. In the years after Reverend Collis died, Nettie noticed that Birdie was watching her differently. Not suspiciously, not yet, but with a particular quality of attention that she recognized, because it was the same quality she herself had applied to patients over 50 years. The watching of someone who has noticed a discrepancy and is quietly building a case. It began, she thought, with the timber agent, or perhaps with Calhoun Prewitt, though that had been before Birdie's time. What Birdie was observing was not the choices themselves, which Nettie kept invisible, but their statistical shadow. In any set of cases, outcomes followed from treatments. A good healer's successes and failures formed a pattern, and a healer who was deliberately producing certain failures would, over enough time, produce a pattern that didn't quite match. Birdie was beginning to see the pattern. She never confronted Nettie directly. Not in the 1880s, not in the 1890s. She continued to work alongside her with the same competence and warmth. She was, in every way that mattered, a devoted and brilliant apprentice who by the 1890s had her own patients, her own reputation, her own voice as a healer in Madison County. She was the thing Nettie had made her into. She was, arguably, the best thing Nettie had ever done. But, in the evenings, after the work was done, and they sat together by the fire, drinking their respective teas, Nettie's chamomile for the insomnia that had plagued her for years, Birdie's lemon balm for resins she kept her own. There were conversations that circled around things without landing on them. Once, in 1895, Birdie said, "I treated old Hampgraves today. The gout is very bad. He's in real pain." Nettie said, "How did you treat it?" Birdie named the treatments, colchicum preparations, which were appropriate, and lifestyle recommendations, also appropriate. There was a pause. Then Birdie said, not looking at Nettie, "He was very unkind to his daughter when she came in with him, not just irritable, the other kind." Another pause. Nettie said nothing. "I wondered," Birdie said carefully, "whether you would have treated him differently than I did." Nettie looked into the fire. "You treated him correctly," she said. "Yes," Birdie said. "I know. A beat. I treated him correctly." She said nothing else, and Nettie said nothing else, and they sat in silence until the fire burned down, and neither of them slept well that night. The shape of a life. To understand Nettie Bowen, you have to hold two things simultaneously, and holding two things simultaneously is something that the human mind resists because it prefers clean stories with clear moral valences. On one hand, she was, by any objective measure, one of the finest healers that Madison County had ever produced. In 50 years of practice, she had saved hundreds of lives. she had delivered hundreds of babies safely into the world, including several that no conventionally trained physician of the era would have been able to save. She had treated epidemic disease, endemic disease, agricultural injuries, war wounds, and the daily physical cost of poverty. She had trained Birdie Plemons, who would go on to heal hundreds more. She had maintained detailed clinical records that would prove invaluable to Dr. Ledbetter and, through him, to the county health system in the 20th century. The pharmacological knowledge she preserved and refined, much of it derived from Cherokee traditions that would otherwise have been lost, was genuine and valuable, and in several cases decades ahead of mainstream medical understanding. Her community adored her. This is not nothing. The people of her hollow and the neighboring hollows came to her not out of desperation or lack of alternatives. They came because she was good at what she did, because her hands and her medicines and her presence had helped them through the worst moments of their lives, because they trusted her with the things that mattered most. That trust was earned. It was real. On the other hand, she had killed 12 people. She had not poisoned them. She had not administered a fatal dose of anything. She had simply, in 12 specific cases, over 30 years, with full deliberation and complete knowledge of the consequences, withheld the treatments that would have saved them. They died of the diseases they had come to her with. They died believing she had done her best. Only she knew. Only she carried it. And carry it she did, not as a secret crushed small and hidden, not as something dissociated from her daily sense of herself. She carried it as a journal entry. She carried it as weight. She had promised Granny Rue that she would not forget the weight, and she had kept that promise in the most literal way she knew. The journal grew, entry by entry, year by year, and each entry was a name and a plant and a sentence, and each sentence was a specific weight that she could feel on the specific days when she chose to feel it. She was, by any conventional moral framework, monstrous. She was also, and this is the thing that makes her story impossible to dismiss, not wrong about some things. Calhoun Prewitt's widow remarried, eventually, a quiet man who treated her well, and the marks stopped appearing on her face. The creek upstream of the family's Fordham's company had poisoned was cleaned up, eventually, after new agents arrived and new practices were implemented. Not because of Nettie's choice. There were other factors. But the outcome she had, in some obscure way, worked toward was real. Reverend Collis's victims, some of them, grew up to be people whose lives, in the fullness of time, contained more than the thing he had done to them. Not because of his death, and not despite it, just alongside it, the way life contains everything alongside everything else. She could not have saved Marcus Collis, and saved them too. Not in the world as she found it, in Madison County in 1887, where there was no legal mechanism, no reporting system, no institutional response that would have protected the children and punished him. She had treated the children. She had witnessed. She had documented. And she had made her choice. She was not wrong about some things. She was also not right. This is the space the story lives in, the space between those two sentences. The land changing. The last years of the 19th century brought visible change to Madison County in ways that the war had not. The war had been violent and immediate. It had changed the human landscape by removing people from it, permanently or temporarily. The changes of the 1880s and 1890s were slower and, in some ways, more total. The timber companies came first, as we have noted, the great old-growth forests that had defined the mountain landscape for millennia, falling to the crosscut saw and the log drive, the ridges going bare in ways that changed the water table, the creek patterns, the ecology of the entire watershed. Nettie watched this with the particular grief of someone who understood what a forest was. Each species lost from a ridge was a potential medicine lost. The ginseng, Panax quinquefolius, the most prized medicinal root in the mountains, used for generations as a general tonic and adaptogen, was already becoming scarce in the over-harvested forests near the logging operations. She moved her ginseng sourcing further and further into the back hollows. Then came the railroad, not directly into her hollow, the terrain prevented that, but near enough to be felt. The Marshall branch of what would become the Southern Railway pushed through the county in the early 1890s, and with it came a different relationship to the outside world. Goods that had been expensive and rare became available. Mail-order catalogs arrived. Patent medicines, those extraordinary bottles of dubious contents and extravagant claims, proliferated. Nettie distrusted most of them, and rightly so. Most contained primarily alcohol, with additions of opium tinctures or, in some cases, genuinely toxic substances presented as cure-alls. She had treated people who had made themselves sick on patent medicines that were supposed to make them well. But she recognized in the railroad's arrival something more fundamental than medicine. The information gap between the mountains and the outside world was closing. Slowly and in an uneven way that would take another generation to fully materialize. But closing. She was in her 50s now. Her hair had gone white early, in her mid-40s, and the white hair combined with the gray eyes gave her a look that people found striking. Not beautiful exactly, not in a conventional way, but striking. The look of a woman to whom the word formidable attached naturally. James Bowen died in 1897. And she grieved him with a thoroughness and a quietness that impressed everyone who watched it. She had loved him. She missed him. She did not stop working. Her practice had changed shape over the decades in ways worth noting. She still treated the full range of conditions, still delivered babies and set bones, and managed the fevers of summer. But increasingly, people came to her for the long, slow illnesses that had no dramatic cure, the degenerative conditions of aging bodies, the chronic ailments that required management over years rather than a single heroic intervention. She was good at these. She was patient with them in a way that younger healers, hungry for clear outcomes, sometimes weren't. She also, in these years, began having a series of encounters with Dr. Henry Morse, a physician from Asheville who occasionally passed through the county on what he described as a survey of medical conditions in the mountain communities. He was polite, well-intentioned, and almost entirely condescending in the way of university-trained men encountering self-taught practitioners. The condescension not cruel or overt, but present in every assumption he made. He was surprised that her records were organized. He was surprised that she could name the Latin binomials for her plants. He was surprised that her patient outcomes, measured against his expectations, were as good as they were. She found him mildly amusing and mildly infuriating in equal measure. She gave him accurate information about her practices. She allowed him to copy her notes. She served him good walnut cake and reasonable coffee. She never told him anything that mattered most. After he left, she would sometimes go to the cedar box and look at the journal. Not open it, just look at it. And she would think about the gap between what people saw when they looked at her and what the journal contained. The gap had been present her entire adult life. She had managed it, she thought, with reasonable success. She had not let it make her dishonest in the ordinary sense. She was, in everything except the specific question of those 12 choices, a scrupulously honest woman. She simply did not volunteer information that no one was equipped to receive. By 1900, the journal contained 12 entries spanning 37 years. The 13th would come later, and the 14th would be, in some ways, the strangest of all. Hattie Shelton's daughter, 1898. Let us spend a moment with the other side of the ledger, because the ledger was never only the dark entries. In the summer of 1898, Hattie Shelton's daughter, a young woman named Mary, named after her grandmother, came to Nettie's cabin with a child dying of typhoid fever. The child was 2 years old, already deeply ill, the characteristic high fever and abdominal rose spots that Nettie had seen in hundreds of typhoid cases over her career. The mortality rate for typhoid in children this age, even with the best care available in 1898, was significant. Nettie worked for 3 days without sleeping. She had, over the years, developed a typhoid protocol that combined her best herbal armamentarium with a rigorous attention to hydration and nursing care that she had reasoned out from first principles long before any formal medical guidance on the importance of hydration and fever management reached these mountains. Chamomile and ginger tea, carefully prepared to support electrolyte balance as best she could manage. Boneset for the fever, elderberry for immune support, cool wet cloths, changed constantly, meticulous attention to the child's fluid output and intake, adjusted hourly. On the 3rd morning, the child's fever broke. Mary Shelton wept. She held her daughter and she wept, and Nettie stood in the doorway of the sick room and watched and felt the thing she had felt at 16 standing in the winter stars. The clean goodness. Still there. Still real. Not diminished by the 12 entries in the journal. Not made false by them. This was the most important thing about Nettie Bowen, and it is the hardest thing to hold on to in a story that contains what her story contains. The clean goodness was not a mask. It was not a performance. The care she took with every patient she was choosing to save was real care. The 12 choices did not hollow out the genuine healer. They existed alongside her. This is not comfortable. It is true. She sent Mary home with the child and the remaining elderberry syrup and instructions for continued care. And she declined the payment Mary tried to press on her. A small amount of coin that Mary's family could not really afford. And she went inside and made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window and watched the light move on the ridge. It had been a very long life. It was going to be somewhat longer. The modern world arriving. The County Health Board was created in 1901. This was not a momentous event in Madison County's daily life. There was no sudden transformation of medical practice. No overnight replacement of root doctors and midwives with university-trained physicians. The board existed mainly on paper at first, a committee of concerned citizens, and the occasional visiting physician, meeting in Marshall to discuss matters of public health and produce reports that had limited effect on what people actually did when they got sick. But it was a beginning. And like many beginnings, it contained within it the shape of what was coming. What was coming was the medicalization of medicine, the slow, decades-long process by which the empirical folk knowledge of healers like Nettie Bowen would be re-examined through the lens of modern pharmacological science, some of it validated, much of it dismissed, the baby reliably accompanying the bathwater out the door. The process by which the county health board would eventually have actual authority to regulate medical practice, require licensing, and, most significantly for someone like Nettie, to audit outcomes. She knew it was coming. She'd been watching its approach for 15 years, since Dr. Morse's visits and the railroad's arrival, and the gradual penetration of Asheville's institutional world into the mountains. She was not afraid of it, exactly. She was watchful. By 1905, she was 64 years old, and she had begun, slowly and deliberately, to prepare. Her clinical records, already meticulous, became even more so. She organized her stock with a precision that went beyond what was strictly necessary for a single healer's practice. She spent hours with Birdie, transferring knowledge, ensuring that the pharmacological reasoning behind her treatments was documented as carefully as the treatments themselves. She also, in 1905, made the 13th entry in the journal. Durham, the 13th entry. His name does not need to be given here because the journal itself never published it, and we will respect that. He was a man who had been involved, over a period of years, in activities that had destroyed the economic futures of several families in the county, through a combination of land fraud and deliberate manipulation of the timber rights system that had developed in the wake of the logging industry's expansion. The specific mechanism was complicated, and the legal system had failed to address it, as the legal system in these years frequently failed to address the claims of poor mountain people against better connected men. He came to her in 1905 with a serious cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat that was causing him real distress, and that, if left untreated, would likely progress to heart failure over a period of months to years. She had foxglove in her stock. She always had foxglove in her stock. The preparation of foxglove, Digitalis purpurea, the plant whose active compounds would eventually be synthesized into digoxin, one of the most important cardiac drugs in the modern pharmacopoeia, was something she had been cautious about for her entire career. Granny Rue had been right. There was no middle ground with foxglove. The therapeutic dose and the fatal dose were uncomfortably close together, and the difference between them required a precision that was difficult to achieve with dried plant material of variable potency. She had used it perhaps a dozen times in 50 years, always with great care, always with full attention to the individual patient's response. For a patient with a cardiac arrhythmia, a carefully monitored foxglove regimen could, in many cases, restore normal rhythm. She had seen this. She knew it was possible. She gave him a different treatment, hawthorn berry preparations, which were genuinely beneficial for cardiovascular health, but which would not address the arrhythmia with the same reliability. She gave him accurate advice about rest and diet. She treated him competently, with visible care, in a way that satisfied his family that she had done everything reasonable. She had not done everything reasonable. She had done everything reasonable except the one thing that would likely have saved him. He died the following spring, his heart gradually losing its rhythm despite the hawthorn treatment. She wrote his name in the journal. She wrote foxglove for the arrhythmia, chose not. She wrote the sentence, which referred to the families. She closed the journal. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. She was 64 years old, and she was tired, and she was beginning, for the first time in 40 years, to wonder about the architecture of the thing she had built. Not to doubt it, not to wish she had done otherwise, but to wonder, with the weariness of age, whether the architecture would survive its builder. What would happen to the journal? What would happen to what it contained? What responsibility she had to the record she had kept so faithfully, so privately, for so long. Dr. Thomas Ledbetter. He first came to the county in 1910, fresh from his second year with the health board, the kind of young man who had a slightly aggressive quality to his competence, the assertiveness of someone who has been told, formally and repeatedly, that he knows more than the people he is about to meet. He was not a bad man. He was a young man, which is a different condition, and one that tends to resolve itself given enough time and enough reality. He came to Nettie's cabin on a Tuesday in October of 1910, riding a mule he had borrowed in Marshall because the road was too rough for the Model T Ford he occasionally used in the lower county. He arrived at the beginning of the afternoon and had clearly expected to spend an hour or two, look around, make some notes, and leave. He stayed until evening. The cabinet stopped him first. He stood in the workroom doorway, looking at the organized rows of labeled jars, perhaps 200 of them, the labels in Nettie's small hand, and the expression on his face shifted from professional assessment to something more like genuine surprise. He asked if he could look more closely, and she said yes, and he moved along the shelves, reading labels and asking questions. He knew some of what he was looking at. The medical school curriculum of that era included some botanical pharmacology, largely the European tradition, the codified knowledge of plants that had been brought into the formal medical system through the work of pharmacognosists and herbalists going back to the Renaissance. He knew golden seal. He knew ginseng, at least by name. He knew malign. But there were preparations on Nettie's shelves that he had never encountered, and when she described their applications and the reasoning behind them, he listened with a quality of attention that she recognized, the attention of someone who is genuinely learning something new. She spent 4 hours with him that afternoon. She was 69 years old. She had been waiting, she thought, for something like this for a long time. Not a disciple, not a patient, but a genuine interlocutor. Someone from the world of formal medicine who was capable of receiving what she knew as knowledge rather than curiosity. He came back. Not that week, but a month later, and then again in the spring, and then regularly through 1911 and 1912. He brought notebooks. He brought questions. He was, she decided, in many respects, a good man, earnest in a way she found endearing, rigorous in a way she respected. He was not equipped, emotionally or experientially, for the full reality of her. But then no one was. She showed him what she could. She also watched him, during those visits, with the same quality of attention she had applied to everything for 50 years. She watched what he did with his notebooks. She watched what he did with his questions. She watched his mind work, And in 1912, she watched him begin to do the one thing she'd always known someone would eventually do. The statistical anomaly. He was looking at death records, not Nettie's personal records, the county death records, the official registrations that had been kept with increasing systematism since the 1880s. He had obtained copies of these records as part of a broader survey of mortality patterns in the county, and he was cross-referencing them against the informal patient records that Nettie had allowed him to copy. He was, essentially, doing epidemiology, looking for patterns in who died and who didn't, and what variables might explain the patterns. It was good medical research by the standards of the time. The pattern he found was not what he had been looking for. He had been looking for patterns that might indicate infectious disease clusters, or nutritional deficiencies, or environmental hazards. What he found instead was something that took him several months to name, because the naming of it required him to consider a possibility he was profoundly reluctant to consider. Certain types of patients who had been treated by Nettie Bowen died at higher rates than the baseline. Not all patients. The overall outcomes under her care were excellent, better than the county average, and far better than what you would expect from a practitioner with no formal medical training. But when he broke the mortality data down by patient type, by the characteristics of the people who had died, a cluster emerged. The dead were not disproportionately the old or the weak or the very sick. The dead were, disproportionately, people who had been involved in documented cases of violence, fraud, or exploitation, men who appeared in court records for assault, men whose business practices had been the subject of legal complaint, men whose deaths had been followed by specific and documentable improvements in the lives of their families or communities. He stared at this for a long time. He was a physician. He was trained in statistics and in the discipline of not overclaiming from incomplete data. He knew that correlation was not causation. He knew that there were 100 possible explanations for a statistical cluster that did not involve what he was beginning to think this cluster involved. He also knew that some of those explanations were more plausible than others. He brought his notebooks to Marshall and sat in the health board office for a very long time, looking out the window at the fall leaves coming down in the courthouse square. Then he went back to the Bowen Hollow. The confrontation. It was November of 1912, a cold afternoon, the year before the end. Nettie was 71, and for the first time in her life, she was visibly aging quickly. The previous winter had been hard on her, a series of respiratory ailments that she had treated herself, methodically, while acknowledging privately that her body was not responding the way it once had. She was in the workroom when he arrived. She heard his mule on the trace, and she went to the window and looked out, and then stood in the workroom for a moment, hands flat on the work table, looking at nothing. He came in without much preamble. He had been coming long enough that ceremony had mostly dropped away between them. He sat on the stool he always used, the one near the window. He set his notebook on his knee. He looked at her. "Mrs. Bowen," he said, "I need to ask you something directly." She looked at him. "Then ask it." He looked at his notebook. "In 50 years of practice," he said carefully, "have you ever chosen not to treat a patient to the fullest extent of your ability?" The room was very quiet. A log shifted in the fireplace. Outside, the mule was cropping at the dead grass by the fence. Nettie looked at him for a long, level moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured and entirely unhurried. "Every healer makes choices, Doctor," she said. "You will too someday. The question isn't whether you choose. The question is whether you're honest about it." He leaned forward. "Mrs. Bowen, I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it fully before you decide what it means." She settled into her chair by the fire, the one she had sat in for 40 years of evenings, and she looked at him with the gray eyes that had seen more of human nature than any classroom produces. "Every physician you have ever trained with has made choices about who receives care and who doesn't. The patient who can't pay, the patient whose prognosis is poor and whose bed is needed, the patient who irritates the nursing staff and somehow receives less attention, the patient who is poor and black in a hospital that considers itself neutral. These choices are made every day in your world by people with medical degrees and institutional authority, and the full approval of the system that employs them. Do you know this?" He said that he did. "The difference," she said, "between your world and mine is not that I make choices and your world doesn't. It's that I make them explicitly, alone, with full knowledge of what I am doing and full acceptance of the weight of it. I don't launder them through a system. I don't outsource them to economics or prejudice or convenience. I own them." She paused. "I own each one completely. I have since 1863. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a crow called. "That is not a defense," she said. "I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to understand me. There's a difference." She looked at him with something that, despite everything, was close to affection. "You're a good doctor, Thomas. You came up here to find superstition, and you found something else. I know you know that." She stood from her chair, slowly. Her joints were bad in November, and went to the workroom. He heard the sound of a box being moved. When she came back, she held the leather journal. She set it on the table between them. "In there," she said, "are 14 names. Beside each name is a plant. Beside each plant is a word." She met his eyes. "Read it after I'm gone, not before. I'm asking you to respect that, and I think you will." He looked at the journal on the table. He looked at her. 14, he said quietly. 14, she said, in 52 years. He picked up the journal. He held it. He did not open it. "What should I do with it?" he asked. She almost smiled. "I don't know," she said. "That's why I'm giving it to you and not burning it. I made my choices. You get to make yours." She took the journal back from him gently. "I'll leave it with Birdie. She'll know when." He left that afternoon without saying much more. She watched him ride up the trace until the laurel thickets swallowed him. She went back inside and sat by the fire for a long time. The 14th entry. 2 months before the end, in July of 1913, she added the last entry to the journal. She had been ill since the spring. The heart trouble that had been murmuring at her for 2 years had become, that summer, explicit. An irregular rhythm, shortness of breath on exertion, the swelling in her ankles that she recognized from 50 years of observing it in patients as a sign of cardiac insufficiency. She knew what was wrong. She had known how to treat it for 50 years. She went to her cabinet on a morning in July, and she stood before it for a very long time. She opened the foxglove drawer, the special cabinet within the cabinet, the one with the iron latch that she had installed 30 years ago specifically to require an extra deliberate action before you could reach this particular plant. She took out the jar. She held it. A careful preparation of foxglove tea, at the right dosage, could almost certainly restore some regularity to her heartbeat. It might buy her another year, possibly 2. She would have to be very careful about the dosage. Her cardiac function was already compromised, which made her more sensitive to the glycosides. But she had administered this herb to others. She knew how. She held the jar for a long time. Then she put it back. She went to the cedar box. She took out the journal. She opened it to the last blank page, and in the small, careful hand that had recorded the others, she wrote, Nettie Bowen, foxglove for the heart, chose not. She paused for a long moment, her pen above the page. Then she wrote the sentence, 72 years was enough. She closed the journal. She put it back in the cedar box. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, and then she went to make her breakfast. She had, she thought, been consistent. Whatever else you said about her, she had been consistent. She had never made a choice she didn't apply to herself. She had been carrying the weight of the others for 50 years, and she was tired, and she knew the way this illness was going to go. And she thought, with the clarity of a woman who has looked at dying people for half a century and knows all its shapes, that 2 more years of slow decline was not a thing she wanted. She had made herself useful. She had done her work. She had written it all down. It was enough. September 1913. And so we return to where we began. The rain on the tin roof, the oil lamp burning low, the bundles of dried herbs in the rafters, their smell ancient and green. The people outside, standing in the rain, dozens of them, not speaking, just being present at the end of something. Birdie Plemons, standing at the other side of the bed, arms folded, eyes that had known for 30 years and never said and never stopped loving. And Dr. Thomas Ledbetter on his stool, his notebook open, the young man who had come to find superstition and found something so much harder and more real. Nettie drifted in and out through the morning. When she was conscious, she talked, not in the rambling way of delirium, but in the deliberate, methodical way she had always talked, as if she was working through a cataloging exercise that needed to be completed before she could leave. She listed plant preparations that she had developed and that were not written in her clinical records. She described dosages for difficult cases. She told Birdie things she had been meaning to tell her for years and had kept back for reasons she could no longer quite remember. Birdie wrote everything down. Her handwriting, Ledbetter noticed, was very like Nettie's, the same small, precise script. You learned handwriting from the people who taught you everything else. At noon, Nettie was quiet for a long time. Ledbetter thought she had slipped into unconsciousness. Then she opened her eyes. Thomas, she said. He leaned forward. I'm here. The big jar on the second shelf from the top, she said. The one labeled Achillea. That's yarrow. Use it for wounds before anything else. Better than most of what you'll find in your kit. A pause. And the Lobelia inflata, the Indian tobacco. Small doses only. It's an expectorant for the deep chest congestion. But very small doses. She looked at him with the gray eyes. You'll be treating people up here for 20 years if you're serious about this county. You should know what works. He said, I'll learn everything you can tell me. She smiled, and it was a real smile, the genuine thing. I know you will. Her eyes moved to Birdie. Something passed between them. Not words, just the long language of women who have worked together for 30 years, who have shared a calling and almost shared a secret, and who will carry each other forward in different ways. Then, her eyes came back to the ceiling, and her breathing changed. It took another 4 hours. Birdie was there. Ledbetter was there. Outside, the rain continued, and the people who loved her stood in it without complaint. She died at 4 p.m. on the 1st of September, 1913. In the hollow's memory, they said the mountains grieved. What actually happened was that people came from ridges and hollows all over the county to stand in the rain and bear witness to the end of something, which is its own kind of grief, and not a small one. Coda. The journal Birdie Plemons gave Dr. Ledbetter the journal the morning after. She handed it to him without ceremony, without explanation. Standing in the doorway of the cabin in the early light while the neighbors moved around inside, doing the work of grief, she simply held it out to him, and he took it. He didn't open it until he had ridden back to Marshall and shut himself in his office and sat for an hour doing nothing, thinking about what he knew and what he was about to know more precisely. Then he opened it. He read it slowly from the first entry, July 1863. Major Garrett Keith, golden seal and plantain for the wound. Did not help the sentence about Shelton Laurel. To the last. He read the 13 names. He read the plants. He read the sentences. Each sentence was short. Each sentence was specific. Each sentence contained a weight that he could feel accumulating in him as he read, the way cold water accumulates in a hollow, slowly, and then all at once. When he reached the 14th entry, Nettie Bowen. Foxglove for the heart. Chose not. 72 years was enough. He put the journal down on his desk and looked at the wall for a very long time. He had been right. He had known from the statistics that something like this was true. But knowing it abstractly as a statistical pattern was not the same as holding the journal in his hands and reading the sentences. It was not the same as understanding that this had been a private moral accounting, kept faithfully for 50 years, by a woman who had been, simultaneously, without contradiction, without hypocrisy, one of the finest healers he had ever encountered, and a woman who had let 12 people die. He thought about what she had said. I own them each completely. He thought about his own patients, the choices already accumulating in his 2 years of practice that he had not written down anywhere, had not accounted for in any journal, had classified mentally as limitations of resources or prioritization of care rather than what they sometimes uncomfortably were. Choices made by him about who mattered enough. He sat with the journal for a very long time. He never published it. He kept it for the rest of his life, which was a long life, as it happened. He practiced in Madison County until 1949, when he retired at 65, and he died in 1961 at 77. He kept the journal in a locked drawer in his office for the first 20 years. Then, when he retired and cleaned out the office, he put it somewhere that no one who knew him ever found. He spoke about it, once, to a colleague, a younger doctor who had been his student, in the informal way that knowledge passes in mountain communities, and who had asked him once why he had never published his extensive notes on Appalachian folk medicine, which would have been genuinely valuable to the field. He had said, "Because I read it and I understood, and understanding that kind of thing changes you in ways you can't undo. The younger doctor had asked what he meant. Ledbetter had been quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There are kinds of knowledge that belong to the person who earned them, not to the institution, not to the public record, to the person." He paused. "She earned it. I'm just the custodian." The younger doctor hadn't entirely understood this. He had filed it away under things old men say that become clear later, which was the right category for it. The journal has never been found. Epilogue. What Nettie knew. There is a plant called spicebush, Lindera benzoin, that grows at the edges of mountain streams in Madison County. It has small yellow flowers in early spring that bloom before the leaves come out. So in February, you see the yellow flowers against bare gray branches, like small, bright decisions. The bark, when you scratch it, smells extraordinary. Spicy and clean and very alive. The smell of the mountain forest in miniature. Cherokee healers used it as a general tonic, a febrifuge, a treatment for colds and rheumatic pain. Granny Roo knew it. Nettie knew it. Birdie knew it. Birdie Plemons practiced until 1938, and the knowledge she carried, the full pharmacological knowledge that Nettie had spent 50 years refining and transmitting, lived in her hands and her records for another generation. Some of it passed to students of Birdie's. Some of it made it, eventually, into the ethnobotanical literature of the mid-20th century, where it sits alongside Appalachian plant knowledge gathered by folklorists and academics who didn't always understand what they had found, but at least wrote it down. Some of it has been validated by subsequent pharmacological research. Some of it awaits validation. The knowledge didn't die with Nettie Bowen. It almost never does. The thing about knowledge is that it leaks out through the seams of every attempt to contain it, flowing forward through time in the hands and notebooks and memory of the people who received it. What did die with Nettie? What was interred with her in the Methodist cemetery on the ridge above the hollow, under a headstone that says, simply, Nettie Bowen, 1841 to 1913, she helped, was the specific moral architecture she had constructed. The framework she had spent 50 years building in the back pages of her medical notebooks, the reasoning that had guided those 12 choices, the attempt to create a coherent ethics for a power that no ethics had ever quite addressed, the power to decide, at the bedside of someone who trusted you absolutely, whether they would live. She had not been right to do it. Most of us, thinking carefully, would conclude this. The framework she built was a real framework. It was not random, not emotional, not corrupt. But it rested on a premise that most ethical traditions reject, that one person can possess sufficient knowledge of another person's moral worth to make a decision about their life. The premise is almost certainly false. Calhoun, Prewitt's wife, remarried well, yes, but we do not and cannot know who Calhoun Prewitt might have become if he had lived. The creek upstream was cleaned up eventually, but not necessarily because Fordham died. The children that Reverend Collis harmed suffered losses that his death did not restore, and that his continued existence might, in some version of events, have been compelled to address. She was not right. She was also not nothing. She was a woman of genuine brilliance and genuine care who possessed, in a time and place where no institutional mechanism existed for the protection of the vulnerable, a unique power, the power of healing knowledge combined with the trust of an entire community. She used that power, almost always, to protect and preserve life. She used it, occasionally, and with terrible deliberateness, in a way that she believed served the same end. Whether it did is a question that history, being history, cannot answer cleanly. What history can do, what we can do, sitting here in the present, far from the rain-soaked hollow, and the lamp, and the old woman dying, is hold the question without resolving it too quickly. Because the question is not really about Nettie Bowen. It is about power, about knowledge, about what we permit ourselves to do when we are certain, and about how often certainty, even genuine, carefully maintained, scrupulously weighted certainty, is a form of the same human error that produces every other wrong choice anyone has ever made. She wrote it down. That is worth something. She carried every name. She let herself die of the same disease she had chosen not to treat in others. Dr. Ledbetter kept the journal, and somewhere in the back hollows of Madison County, in the early spring, the spice bush flowers come out yellow against the gray branches, years before everything else is ready to bloom.